As we continue this series leading up to the 250th anniversary of American independence, I want to revisit a point that I think is important. The United States is not currently in a position to celebrate. Celebration is for accomplishment. Celebration is for success. Celebration is for moments when a nation can look at itself in the mirror and honestly say that it's lived up to its ideals. And that is clearly not where we're at. But the 250th anniversary of American independence is a time for resolve. It's a time to recommit ourselves to the best parts of the American experiment. It's time to ask whether we have been faithful stewards of the ideals embodied in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution of the United States. And it's time to ask what our responsibilities are to future generations. Hi, I'm Nate Charles, and welcome back to the Rule of Law Brief. Today, I want to talk about the importance of being annoying. Throughout history, the people who have changed society for the better were often viewed as troublemakers. In fact, more often than not, they were viewed as troublemakers. The American patriots who challenged the British crown were annoying. The abolitionists were annoying. The suffragettes were annoying. The labor movement was annoying. The civil rights movement was annoying. Every one of these movements was criticized in its own time by people who wished they would simply stop making trouble and leave well enough alone. But that's the thing about meaningful reform. If a system is functioning unjustly, correcting the injustice necessarily disrupts the status quo. The people who benefit from the status quo almost always prefer silence. The people trying to change it almost always become inconvenient. And that's not merely a historical observation. It's a principle recognized by scholars and even military theorists who study resistance movements and political change. One U.S. Army study of resistance movements observed that passive resistance in the early stages usually takes the form of actions calculated to gain attention, or to be a nuisance to government forces. Notice that phrase, be a nuisance. Not violent, not terroristic, a nuisance. The same study describes demonstrations, picketing, public symbols, and similar activities as attention-getting devices. Why? Because attention is the scarce and most valuable resource in politics. Problems that nobody notices rarely get solved. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. But there's a deeper lesson here. Most people think power comes from force. Governments have armies. Governments have police. Governments have courts and prisons. But force is only part of the story. As another military study explains, governments ultimately depend upon voluntary assistance and the cooperation of large numbers of people. To quote our own Declaration of Independence, governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. In other words, power depends upon legitimacy. It depends upon public acceptance. It depends upon people believing that institutions deserve their cooperation. They're not simply trying to win arguments. They are trying to persuade enough people to rethink assumptions they previously accepted without questioning. Historians sometimes describe the institutions and groups that sustain a political system as its pillars of support. Journalists, teachers, the clergy, business leaders, political officials, and even ordinary citizens. When enough people in enough places begin asking uncomfortable questions, those pillars start to shift. And that process is uncomfortable. That process is annoying. But make no mistake, being annoying is not enough. You also have to be right. A person can be loud and wrong. A movement can be disruptive, but also wrong. A cause can attract attention and still deserve to fail. Legitimacy matters. Evidence matters. Truth matters. In fact, research on resistance movements repeatedly finds that nonviolent movements tend to be more successful than the violent ones. Why? Because violence often shifts attention away from the issues themselves and onto the violence. Nonviolent movements tend to force society to confront the right questions. Is the grievance legitimate? Is the policy just? And are people being treated fairly? Martin Luther King Jr. understood this perhaps better than anyone. The civil rights movement did not succeed because it could overpower the government. At no point could the civil rights movement overpower the government. The civil rights movement succeeded because it exposed contradictions between America's stated values and its actual practices. The lunch counter sit-ins were annoying. The freedom rides were annoying. The boycotts were annoying. The marches were annoying. And that was the point. As King explained in his letter from a Birmingham jail, nonviolent direct action creates constructive tension that forces a community to confront issues it would otherwise prefer to ignore. Not violence, attention. Not destruction, accountability. The same pattern appears again and again throughout history. The people who move society forward are rarely the people telling us that everything is fine. Almost always, they are the people who refuse to stop pointing out that it isn't. And as we approach America's 250th anniversary, I think that's one of the lessons worth remembering as part of our strategy of resolve. Our obligation is not blind loyalty. Our obligation is stewardship of America's best values. Our obligation is to preserve what is good, reform what is broken, and hand future generations a republic stronger than the one we inherited. And more often than not, that means being willing to be annoying. Ask uncomfortable questions. Challenge convenient lies. Refuse to remain silent when silence would be easier. But if we're going to do that, and we will do that, we have a corresponding responsibility. We have to be right. And that's the upshot of today's video. If you know you're right, and if you're listening to this video, you've probably already done more homework than most. Then get out there and be annoying. Ask hard questions, demand evidence, challenge convenient falsehoods. Refuse to let important issues disappear simply because someone in power would prefer that they do. Between now and July 4th, between now and the 250th anniversary of American independence, and every day thereafter, be annoying. Be relentless, be persistent, be peaceful, but be annoying. Injustice is permitted by people who quietly accept what they know to be wrong. History is made by the people who refuse to stop pointing it out until the rest of the world finally catches up.